Morning. Okay, how was everybody's Thanksgiving? Good? How many people ate responsibly? You liars. Then you're not doing it right. Listen, here's the thing. If you don't pass out from turkey poisoning, you suck at this. Because that's what's supposed to happen. You should be able to be lit on fire and still sleep after you've eaten enough turkey. That's just the way it should be. Okay, we're going to stay in the book of 2 Kings. Today we're still in our King series. The title of today's message is Thankless in Samaria, and you'll kind of figure that out as we go on. But I was going to prepare a message just for, the Thanksgiving holiday, but we just so happened to fall in a place where I think that it really depicts the idea of thankfulness and the repercussions of a lack of thankfulness. So today we're going to take a look at what happened in Israel during a time when finally all of the times that they'd abandoned God kind of come back to roost for them, okay? Now, I know we just celebrated Thanksgiving, but right now, I don't know if you guys, I hope you don't feel this way, but some people feel like there's not a lot to be thankful about right now. And I do understand that it's a difficult time. I get it, right? I mean, we're in the middle of a worldwide, pandemic, and we just endured a long and still are enduring a long election process that's controversial. People are out of work, kids are out of school, so parents are going crazy, and, the country's divided. I mean, we're in a difficult time. I heard it described the other day as we live in desperate times. I don't know that I agree with that, but there's an old saying that desperate times call for what? Desperate measures. I don't know that I agree with that old saying. I don't think it's always true, because one thing you'll see in the scripture is when things get desperate, if you hold on, God usually is about to do something huge. And we're going to see an example of that today. But I kind of feel like when things are difficult, sometimes it's God trying to show us where we stand, to kind of show us where we are. Generally, if we're honest, when things are awry in our life, it's because of something we've done or a sin in our life. You ever notice that? The Bible tells us in Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man sows, what? This he will also reap. I hate that passage because it scares me. You know what I mean? But it is, should I say I hate a passage? But I'm just saying, it scares me because it's so true. We have to admit most of the times when we're going through trying times, whether it be as people or as a nation, generally it's in a time when we've just kind of pushed God out of the picture. And we get what we get when we end up in that situation. But here's the thing. Thankfully, God never forgets about us. God never pushes us out of the picture. And I still believe that God is going to do something amazing. I think we're right at the brink of seeing God move in a big way. And for that reason, I'm thankful. And anyone who knows Jesus should be thankful because we have promises that go beyond what you see going on around you. God is going to take care of his people. Now, today we're going to see Israel reaping, like I said, some of the consequences of their years of abandoning and rejecting God. But they're going to see, just like we said, that, when it seems hopeless, God's going to show up for them. So let's jump into 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 24. And I'm going to be skipping a few verses here and there because we are having communion today, which I'm excited about. And so I can't get too long-winded. And you know me, I'm not that long-winded anyway. But so 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 24. It says, now it came about after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. Now remember, Samaria was the capital of Israel at that time. There was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head, listen to this, a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a fourth of a cab of dove's dung was for 5 shekels of silver. Okay, so here's where we're at. The king of Aram, you remember, the king of Aram was organizing, last week we talked about how he was organizing these little raiding parties because they were at some kind of a peace with Israel that wasn't really peace. And they were basically laying in wait along the roads and looting the Israelis when they would go by. And they would go into small villages and capture people and put them in slavery. And they were just doing a lot of stuff like that, sneaking around with these little raiding parties, trying to steal from and loot Israel and take their people. Well, God got sick of it. So God started telling Elisha, well, here's when it's going to happen. And he started warning the king of Israel. And when the king of Israel found out those things, he started avoiding those places, so it made the king of Aram mad. So what the king of Aram did was he said, who's telling him where we're going to attack? Well, they told him it was Elisha, so he goes and camps around where Elisha is. And right when Elisha's servant, scared and in desperation mode, he says, Lord, open his eyes. And he saw that there was a great army around him of God's armies that was surrounding the army that had them in jeopardy. As a result, Elisha asked God to strike that army blind, and he led them into Samaria, where they were actually treated and released. He gave them food and let them go. So you would think after all that, the Bible says at the end of that chapter, at the end of that story, that the raiding party stopped. And I think sometimes we hear that and we think, wow, that means that there was happily ever after between Aram and Israel. And that just wasn't the case. See, here's one thing that you couldn't wipe away. Ben-Hadad II, was the king of Syria or Aram. Okay? And he hated Israel. Now, he may have stopped the raiding parties, and I'm not sure that was because he was a good guy. I think he was more afraid God was going to keep narking on him, right? So he decides he still wants to be warring with Israel, so he decides he's going to besiege it. He's going to set up a fortress around them with an army to keep them from going in or out. This means no one could go in and bring food in to sell it or resources, and no one could go out and go get resources or food. Okay, so he was completely locking them in. They were on lockdown. I'm just going to leave it there. Never mind. Anyway, so no one could get in, no one could get out. So basically what he was trying to do is he was trying to starve them into submission. Now, if that were with me, it would take all of 3 minutes, and I'd be like, I give up. I got to have a pizza. But it lasted quite a while, and his plan started working because Samaria fell into this massive, massive famine. The famine was so severe that people had to eat things that no self-respecting Israeli would eat. Things that were unclean. For example, donkeys, which just makes me sick thinking about it. But they were literally eating donkeys. And under the law, donkeys were considered an unclean animal. You could not eat them. But there was nothing left to eat. So they started eating donkeys. And eventually, something that became a very valuable commodity was buying donkeys' heads to eat them. And it would cost the equivalent of 2 pounds of silver to buy one, to eat a donkey's head. Now people say, why did they get so valuable? Well, they ate all the donkey bodies in the kingdom. All that was left, they probably cut the head off thinking, who eats that? And 3 months later, they're going, ooh, that's looking pretty good about right now, right? So that's why they were eating these donkeys' heads, right? Now, it says they also ate dove's dung. Dove's dung, okay? Now, this is more controversial than you think. And it said that a cab, which is approximately 2 quarts, was pretty expensive. It sold for 5 shekels. Right now, Jewish historians have fought about what this was for years. And I'm just telling you this because some of your translations will say that they ate seed pods. And some of your translations will say that it was dove's dung. So there's different viewpoints on this. Some Jewish historians say that dove's dung was actually a slang. They would say when they didn't like something, they didn't want to eat it. It's kind of like when we see something and we go, gosh, that stuff is crappy. I don't want to taste that crap. It's not really crap. You just refer to it as crap. You know what I mean? And some say that there was a slang around at that time that sounded like that. So some of the Jewish historians believe that's what it was. Some others believe that it was these little seed pods. That's why some of your translations translate it that way. They would grind them up and eat them, and they were very close to inedible and nasty. They were not good. They were terrible. Nobody liked them. Some believe that it was those seed pods. And then there's still others who believe that it is exactly what it says it is, dove poop. Now, it makes sense. If you're going to eat a donkey's head, is dove poop a stretch? I kept thinking to myself, how do they prepare that food? Donkey's head tacos, kids. Dove poop soup. I don't know. But, this is where they're at. Either way, they were forced to eat disgusting, unthinkable things because there was just no food. They were in the middle of a desperate, desperate famine. But when you read this, you think, wow, this can't get worse. They're eating donkey heads. How much worse can it get? But it does get worse. Look at this, 2 Kings 6:26. It says, as the king of Israel, now the king of Israel at that time was Jehoram, as the king of Israel was passing by the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, help, my lord, O king. He said, if the Lord does not help you, from where shall I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress? Okay, so here's what's happening. This king decides, this is Jehoram, and he decides he's going to walk around and check out the walls of the kingdom. Because listen, they were starving him out, but the walls were protecting him. Okay? Remember, Samaria was located up on a hill, and it was a fortress. It had big walls. So he's walking around kind of inspecting the walls, and he knows things are desperate at that time, right? Well, this woman yells out to him and asks him for help. Now, something you need to know about Jehoram, he was Ahab's son, and he was an idiot. And I just wonder if, Ahab and Jezebel were related, because all their kids were idiots, okay? And he was no exception. And like Ahab and the kings before him, these kings that were seeking after, pagan gods and things, none of them would ever accept blame for anything that was going on under their leadership. None of them would ever accept anything. And whenever they were asked to, they would always find someone else to blame rather than say, I'm just a terrible leader, right? So you can tell by his response to this woman's problems that he didn't feel responsible and he was looking for somebody to blame. Because he basically said, she said, help me. And he said, well, what the heck am I supposed to do about it? He says, ask your God. And that's basically what this translates to. It actually translates more like, why don't you let your God help you? This is basically how he responded. So you could see who he was starting to get mad at and who he was starting to blame, which was God, right? He was starting to blame God. And it's funny because, it wasn't that long ago that this same God that he's blaming for everything marched an entire army into the middle of that capital without firing a shot and left them in his control. And we don't see any evidence that he was ever thankful for that or that he was ever, pleasing to God after that point. It's like he just blew it off, right? So as usual, he was just blaming God, but he never thanked God when things went well. This is just who he was, right? Now, ironically, if he were to be honest, if any of the kings before him, several of them would have been honest, he would have said, you know why this kingdom is in this situation? Because I pulled us away from God, that's why. I allowed you guys to seek pagans. I allowed you guys to intermarry with pagan nations. I allowed you guys to follow these idol gods, and God has told us not to do these things. And so everything we're suffering is my fault because as king, I have the power to make you worship the right God, and I haven't done it. But he was never going to accept that much blame. He was never going to accept that. So it made him angry. And you'd think he couldn't get any more angry until you hear what this woman says to him next. Okay, this really shocked him and even made him more mad. 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 28. It says, and the king said to her, what is the matter with you? I don't know how he said that. I just think of how I say that to my kids when they do something stupid. What is the matter with you? Maybe that's not. Anyway, and the king said to her, what is the matter with you? And she answered, this woman said to me, give me your son that we may eat him today. How does the conversation get there? Okay? Give me your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. Anyway, so we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, give your son that we may eat him, but she has hidden her son. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Tearing your clothes was a way of showing great distress, or sometimes it was mourning. And basically they would tear himself and sew it right back up in the same spot so it wasn't quite so hard to tear the next time, right? But he tore his clothes. This was a sign of discontentment or anger or mourning. It was just a sign that he didn't like what was going on, right? So it said that he tore, where was that? It said, so when the king heard these words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now, when he was passing by on the wall and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body. Now, this is another way of showing mourning, was sitting in ashes and putting ashes on yourself. Verse 31, then he said, may God do so to me and more also, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on him today. Okay, so she just calls out for help. He's in a bad mood. He's like, what do you want help from me for? It's not my fault. It's God's fault, right? Why don't you ask your God to help you? Then she says, wait. He's like, well, what's the problem? She says, well, you see, we made this deal that we were going to eat our children. You see a problem here? See, she revealed that it had gotten so desperate in Israel at this point in Samaria that they were resorting to cannibalism, even eating their own children, which I hope their own children had better hygiene than my kids did at that age, but they were even eating their own children. And the king, again, didn't want to take any blame. He'd already blamed God. He had to find somebody else to blame, so he goes, you know what? That Elisha, it's Elisha's fault. And, the same happened to me and worse if I don't take his head off today. Right? And here's what he probably thought. He had heard of and witnessed Elisha do these amazing supernatural miracles. I mean, he did raise people from the dead. And, he'd probably heard where Elisha made a woman's jar never run empty. And her oil never run empty. So she always had the stuff to make bread. Every time she'd dip in, it was still there. He probably remembered that. So he was probably thinking to himself, why doesn't Elisha just work another one of his food miracles and end this? What's the problem? Why doesn't he just fix this mess? What he didn't realize was, unfortunately, that simply just wasn't possible in this case. And here's why. Years earlier, God had warned Israel, and he knew full well about this, that if they didn't start being more thankful and turning from their sin and turning from their disobedience, that he would allow their sin to turn into desperation. Okay, listen to this. Deuteronomy 28:49 says, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance who will have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd and the produce of your ground until you are destroyed, who also leaves you no grain, new wine, nor the incense of your herd, nor the increase of your herd, or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. Now listen to this. It shall besiege you. Sound familiar? It shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls. Now remember, Samaria, the capital of Israel, was located high up on a hill, and it was known for its fortified walls. And your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout your land, and it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you. Then you shall eat the offspring, what? Of your own body. Sound familiar? The flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord has given you during the siege and distress by which your enemy will oppress you. So years earlier, God said, if you don't stop turning against me, if you don't stop rejecting me, if you don't start becoming more thankful for all the blessings I've brought on your nation, I'm going to allow you to see what happens to people who aren't thankful, and I'm going to allow you to experience the consequences of people who reject God, and you're going to reap what you sow. So because neither Jehoram nor his father nor his grandfather turned Israel away from these pagan things and back to God, this prophecy had to come true. Elisha couldn't fix that because God said this is going to happen. It had to happen. This was their own fault. Right? I mean, they had become so far from God. See, Israel's always been a little too premature to get desperate. Okay, they always wanted to give up immediately. Right? They were just kind of like that. They'd surrender immediately to every little distress that came in your life. You ever meet the person like that? As soon as something happens, I quit, I'm done, what's the point? You ever meet that person? Yeah, don't point at them. But this is basically how Israel was. And, it blows me away, all the things that God has done, all the miracles that God has wrought in Israel, all the things they had witnessed, all the power and all the mighty miracles God had done in their presence. And something like this happens. They had gotten so far from God that they never even thought maybe of calling out to God when all this started. Did they forget that they served a God of forgiveness who willingly restores people who just ask? Had they forgotten all the scriptures and all the promises that said, if you would just call out to me, even in your transgression, I'll heal you? But they were so distant from God, they didn't even think about calling on him. Had they forgotten? Look at this. Proverbs 28:13 says, he who conceals his transgression will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion. Psalm 34:17, the righteous cry, and the Lord what? Hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. They knew this. Verse 18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I don't know if you get more crushed in spirit than eating donkey's heads and your own kids, right? It saves them who are crushed in spirit. Verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him what? Out of them all. They knew these things. But they had drifted so far from God. They had become so unthankful They had no gratitude whatsoever for everything God had done, and they slowly but surely were pushed away from God. A nation that was identified as God's people, that was identified by the true and living God, all of a sudden wouldn't even call on him when times were so desperate. They're eating donkeys and dove poop and their kids. I mean, this is how far from God they had drifted. And I can't help, I'm going to preach this because, listen, as I was reading this, I almost had to laugh because, man, does this sound familiar? Does it not sound, anybody else think about that? I mean, think about this for a second. It makes me think of our own nation today for so many reasons. First of all, we're too quick to question or doubt God and too slow to thank him for anything. You notice that? You know, it's not even in style. It's not even fashionable to talk about Jesus anymore. You know, if you start talking about God or start talking about Jesus, people roll their eyes. You know what? They can suck it up because I'm going to do it anyway. Right? But here's the problem. You know, people, we're so quick to question and doubt God and so slow to thank him, so slow to praise him. And like Israel, our elected officials don't accept responsibility for anything. Have you noticed that? This party blames this party, and this party blames this party, and they're all hoping another party comes in so they can all blame them, right? And here's what happens. Everything that concerns us, everything that we need help with gets pushed off to the side while they play politics and fight with each other so they can make sure they can have new beach houses in California while people are out of work. This is what happens. We've elected people who do not care and will not take responsibility. Sounds just like Jehoram, doesn't it? Exactly like Jehoram, right? Like Jehoram, listen, while they blame each other, while they try to lead this nation away from God, they forget that the same God that has brought us through so many things is just sitting off to the side and waiting for somebody to call on him. During these times in Israel, at any moment, if their leader would have said, let's turn back to God, he was waiting. He's watching what's going on. He's saying, just think about me long enough to call on me, and I'll take all this away from you. I'll take this away. But no one had the mind to call on him. And just like that, I see our nation. A nation that was formed, one nation what? Under God. That's falling apart around us, and we think, gosh, what's going wrong? I can tell you what, we forgot the last part of one nation under God. Right? And now we've pretty much abandoned him. We're thankless, just like this. You know, I'd just love to see someone in this country remember all the odds we've had to beat to be where we are today, and we beat them because God's hand was on us. And now we've turned our backs on him. You know, I just don't understand. He's just waiting for us to be thankful enough to call out on him, to call him out. Listen, if there's one thing all mankind should be thankful for, is that God doesn't hold grudges, and he's gracious, and he forgives, and he restores. No matter how bad, how deep the problem, he restores. He's gracious, and he's loving. I mean, when struggles arise, we're kind of like Israel. We too quickly bail. That shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't turn prematurely to a state of desperation. We shouldn't do that. I mean, have you ever gotten so far from God that you find that you've forgotten all the things he's done for you? I mean, do you remember when you said, God, if you just answer this one prayer, and he answers it, you know what I mean? And then you're like, oh, Lord, if you just make that not happen, I'm so worried, and he answers that. 6 months later, when something comes up, you forgot he's even done those other two things. It just makes me think so much of what's going on here. If we would just, when difficult times come on us, just turn to God. You know how much desperation we would not experience if we just learned to do that? Just like Israel, if they would have just learned to do that. You know, today we're going to take communion, which I am stoked about. And what communion is a time of remembrance, and it's a time of reflection, right? And too often I think we celebrate it like a ritual, don't you? Oh, it's communion. Give me the bread, give me the juice, right? And then go on about your business. And that's not the way it should be. Sometimes I think we're not even remembering why. See, first and foremost, communion should remind us of the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ, how he gave everything so we could have eternal life. That's the first thing it should remind us of. And secondly, it should make us reflect on the condition of our relationship with Christ. That was one of the things the Apostle Paul told them was, hey, before you take communion, check yourself. Why? You don't have to deserve communion. He just wants you to understand that while you're thinking back to the sacrifice he made to make you a child of God, check and see if there's anything you're doing that is hindering God from being able to bless you. Maybe you're in a situation that seems desperate because you've allowed yourself to drift away from him. And communion should be that time when you go, I see the things in my life. I'm being honest with myself. I see the things that's pushing me away from you. I see how thankless I've become. I see how ungrateful. I see how I've just been so distracted. But because I'm remembering what you did for me, today is going to inspire me to do better. Forgive me. That's what it's about. That's what it's all about. It's not supposed to be this somber time. Sometimes you go into a church and think it's a funeral and it's communion. Listen, you should be happy. You should be joyous. It's a celebration, right? But during that celebration, we should check ourselves. And sometimes I'm afraid we're just not doing that. Because if we're not careful, we're going to end up just like the Israelites were in Elisha's time. Listen, I mean, when we forget who God is and who we are in him, you know what that leads to? Desperation. Because if you're not leaning on him, times are desperate. I'll be honest with you. Desperation makes us do dumb things, things that we'll regret, things that are unnecessary if we could just learn to trust God. Because listen, here's the deal. No matter how bad it gets, he won't abandon us. He never abandons us, and that's something that should inspire you. And the sooner you're ready, listen, sometimes people go, well, I understand, and he's still not. Listen, if God isn't pulling you out of a struggle you're in, he's trying to teach you through that struggle. Right? The sooner you say, God, show me why, the quicker you'll get out of it. But God is always trying to restore and lift us up and set us back on good ground. I just feel like sometimes we're like Israel was here, and he's not even on the menu. We're not even thinking about him. You know what I mean? Let's move on. 2 Kings 6:32. It says, now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. And the king sent a man from his presence. But before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, do you see how this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head? Listen, I don't think it's a smart thing to try to sneak up on a prophet. You know? I mean, really? He thought he was going to sneak up on Elisha. You know, they're probably all sitting there playing euchre or something. Elisha goes, oh, hold on a second. The king sends somebody to kill me. I mean, that's how easily he's going to know something's wrong, all right? It says, look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? While he was still talking with him, behold, the messenger came down to him and said, behold, this is evil from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? So this messenger, just like the king, Jehoram, comes down and says, you and God are the problem. This evil's from your God. Why should I wait any longer? Why shouldn't I just take you and have your head ripped off, cut off, however you want to do it, right? So basically the king sends a hitman. I mean, God had just delivered a whole army into his hands. He knew how powerful God was. The next trouble they come up against, he sends a hitman to try to kill Elisha. And Elisha's like, listen, don't kill me. Let me tell you something. Go back and tell your king he's given up too quick, like he always does. Tell him he's given up too soon. Listen, like you always do, you tried everything else before you come to me. No one came to me during this. No one came to God and said, let me help or give us help in this situation. And now the only reason you're coming to me is to blame me and to blame God and to kill me. So let me tell you what's going to happen here. God is going to deliver him. Listen to this. Let's skip down verse 1 in chapter 7. It says, then Elisha said, listen to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. So he's saying, tomorrow there's going to be so much food here, because I'm going to bring a miracle even though you didn't ask. Even though you came here to kill me, I'm going to show you what could have happened before any of this happened if you would have just trusted God. Tomorrow there's going to be so much food in Samaria that it's going to be cheap. 24 hours from now. The royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered the man of God and said, behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? Then he said, behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. Okay, so basically Elisha's saying, okay, I'm going to do this because Israel needs to see who God is. I'm not doing it because you deserve it. And had you come to me before this whole mess started, you wouldn't be in this mess you're in right now. How many people can say that about a situation in your life? You don't have to raise your hand, but have you ever come to God and he works powerfully like he always does and gets you through a situation, and the first thought that hits your mind is, I wish I would have done that 6 months ago. You know what I mean? That happens all the time. You finally surrender to God. He does what he always does. He amazes you, and you think, gosh, why don't I do that on the first time every time? Right? This is what's happening here. But this servant was bought into the king's propaganda, and he's like, listen, you're not going to make that much food appear. If God were to make windows and they were to toss it out in potato sacks, it couldn't fill that much food in Samaria tomorrow. So I'm not buying it. And I love what Elisha says. Elisha says, okay, well, listen, you don't have to understand how God delivers. You just have to realize that God delivers. And because you've doubted God, and because you're thankless, and because you don't believe in the power of God, you'll see the miracle, but you'll never taste any of that food. Right? Listen, have you ever had your prayers hindered because you look at your situation and can't figure out how God's going to fix it? Anybody ever been there? You're like, gosh, I'd pray about it, but I've gone over every scenario, and I just don't see how God's going to fix it. If only he created the world in 6 days. If only he walked on water. If only he could raise the dead. Maybe I would go to him. But I went through every scenario. I ran it through my computer program, and I'm in trouble here. Listen, God doesn't need you to understand how he's going to answer your prayers. He just needs you to believe that he can and will. And let's be honest, if the end result's the same, do you really care how he does it? Maybe, I never look at my pizza and go, gosh, I wonder where they got that sausage. I don't care. I just eat it. Listen, God's capable. Trust him with it. Who cares how he does it? Right? So this is something he's learning all too quickly here. Right? Now, this next thing kind of cracks me up. 2 Kings 7:3. I'm skipping a few verses here in a second. It says, now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, why do we sit here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, then the famine is in the city, and we will die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now, therefore, come and let us go over to the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we will live, and if they kill us, we will but die. You know what they were saying? We're going to die anyway. We can't go in there. They don't want us in there. And plus, there's no food, and I'm not eating another donkey's head. Right? So I die if I go in there. I die if I sit here. If we go to the Arameans' camp and beg for mercy, there's that little chance that they'll spare us and give us food. If they don't, are we any worse off? They're just going to kill us. We're going to die here anyway. So I kind of like the reasoning, although it's kind of strange. Verse 5, it says, they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Arameans, and when they came to the outskirts of the camp of the Arameans, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and the sound of horses, even the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Therefore they arose and fled in twilight and left their tents and their horses and their donkeys. If I was the donkey, I'd be afraid. And their donkeys, even the camp just as it was, and fled for their life. When these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they entered one tent and ate and drank and carried from there silver and gold and clothes and went and hid them. And they returned and entered another tent and carried from there also and went and hid them. So this is so funny. But anyway, these lepers go in and find out, they're just going to go surrender. And they find out this whole army's gone. And they left everything. They left their resources. They left their tents. They left all the food that it took to feed thousands in an army, just laying around like a big desert buffet. And I think it's funny, the first person that these lepers think of is themselves. They're like, throw us outside the camp, will you? And they're just mowing, eating all these people's stuff and stealing it and hiding it in their tent, right? Because this whole army just disappeared. And here's how that happened. Remember the army that appeared when the servants' eyes were opened that surrounded the army that was going to come in on them? I can't help but think when God confused them and they heard the sounds of chariots and hooves, and it sounded like thousands of men coming their way and scared them. You ever wonder if that was just God's army riding circles around the camp going, time to go, boys? You ever wonder? One way or another, once again, without firing a shot, this army was defeated. And they were completely gone, and they left all the food and resources you could ever need. Now, at first, these lepers were pigging out, but then they eventually felt guilty. Let's jump down to verse 9. Then they said to one another, we are not doing right. After they're all full and grease all over their face and they got all the clothes hidden, they're not doing right. This day is a day of good news, but we are keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now, therefore, come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, we came to the camp of the Arameans, and behold, there was no one there, nor the voice of man, only the horses and the donkeys tied, and the tents just as they were. The gatekeepers called and told it within the king's household. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to skip a few verses, but here's the thing. You would think that the king would look at this as a blessing, but he doesn't even trust that it's true. So what he does is he sends people to spy it out to see if the lepers are telling the truth. Because he can't even give God enough credit to do something that amazing, that he has to send somebody to verify if what the lepers found was true. Let's jump to verse 15. They went after them to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was full of clothes and equipment which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. Then the messengers returned and told the king. So the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. Then a measure of fine flour, listen, was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now, remember he said, tomorrow there's going to be so much food it's going to be cheap? And then he told the servant, the messenger, he said, yeah, you're going to see it, Mr. Doubter, but you're not going to taste it. Remember that. Verse 17. Now the king appointed a royal officer on whose hand he leaned to have the charge of the gate. Now this is the guy who he sent to Elijah. But the people trampled him at the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who had spoke when the king came down to him. So he got appointed the gatekeepers. He got to see all this food coming in, but everybody just started rushing to the gate because they wanted to get their share of the food, and trampled him to death. Which is sad but kind of funny. Right? So he got to see it, and then that's how he was put to death. Verse 18. It happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel and a measure of fine flour for a shekel will be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. Then the royal officer answered the man of God and said, now behold, if the Lord should make the windows of heaven, or make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he said, behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him at the gate, and he died. So just like that, immediately, what had been plaguing their lives for so long was gone. And the only thing that changed was they called on God. And you know what had to be going through the minds of all those people? Maybe before I got desperate, maybe before I did desperate things, maybe I should have gave God a chance to amaze me. Maybe I should have remembered and been thankful for everything he's already done in my life. If I had just done that, I wouldn't even have had to deal with this famine. Listen, I can't take much more time, but if there's one thing we can learn from this lesson is we are too quick to accept desperation and to surrender to it. Listen, we immediately act like the situation's so bad that there is no help, but there is help, and his name's Jesus. And here's the thing. If Christian people would learn to put their faith in God like we used to, you will find out that desperation, disbelief, and thanklessness can't coexist where somebody has strong faith that their God is who he says he is. So you can make a choice today. You can either live in faith and avoid these kind of problems, and when problems arise unforeseen, know that God's going to deliver you, or you can give in to your desperation and eventually lose everything. This is such a powerful lesson. There's more, but I'm going to have to go ahead and close there. But before I